need to check the used names list, then write the story. The band names are Walter Hamilton Lockwood, Daniel, Christopher, Eleanor, Harold Whitmore, Nathaniel, Brittany, Lily, Raymond, Marcus, Bernard, Patricia, Rudy, Gregory, Addie, Gloria, Frank Caldwell, Connie, Todd, Serena. I'll use fresh names: Arthur, narrator, Kevin, son, Diane, daughter-in-law, Sophie, granddaughter, Miles, old friend, lawyer, Helen, deceased wife. I keep a small notebook on the kitchen counter. Nothing fancy, just one of those yellow legal pads I use to bring to job sites. Old habit. For 31 years, I ran a plumbing supply company out of a warehouse on Route 9 in Garfield, New Jersey. Started it with $11,000 I'd saved working for someone else, and a used delivery truck with a cracked windshield I kept meaning to fix. By the time I retired, we had 4 trucks, 12 employees, and accounts with every major contractor in Bergen County. I built that company the same way I built everything: slowly, carefully, without cutting corners. My wife Helen used to joke that I treated the business like a 4th child. She wasn't wrong. Helen passed 4 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. 11 weeks from diagnosis to the end. I still reach for her side of the bed some mornings before I remember. After she was gone, I rattled around the house alone. My son Kevin and his wife Diane started coming around more. Checking in, they said. I appreciated it. I did. Kevin is my oldest. We'd had our rough patches over the years. He'd wanted to come work in the business right out of high school, and I'd told him to go to college first, get a degree, learn something other than what I could teach him. He'd resented that for a while, but I thought we'd made our peace. My granddaughter Sophie is Kevin's daughter from his first marriage. She was 19 at the time all of this happened, living with her mom about 40 minutes away, finishing up her associate's degree at community college. We'd always been close, Sophie and me. She had a habit of texting me pictures of sunsets with no caption. Just the picture. I always texted back a thumbs up, which she said made me look ancient, but I kept doing it because it made her laugh. The first sign I missed, and I did miss it, I'm not pretending otherwise, was a conversation Kevin had with me about 6 months after Helen died. He sat down at the same kitchen table and told me he and Diane were thinking about expanding their landscaping business. They needed capital. He didn't ask me directly. He just laid it out there, kind of floating it, the way he always did when he wanted something and wasn't sure I'd say yes. I told him I'd think about it. I didn't say no. I didn't say yes. I let it sit. About 2 weeks later, Diane came by herself. Kevin was at a job, she said. She brought a coffee cake, which should have told me something right there, because Diane had never once brought me food in the 11 years of marriage to my son. She sat across from me and started talking about the business again. She had numbers this time, projections. She said they were looking at buying a second truck and hiring 2 more crews. She said if they could just get past this hump, they'd be in great shape. I listened. I said I'd think about it. What I didn't tell her was that I'd already talked to Miles. Miles Okafor had been my accountant for 22 years. I trusted him more than almost anyone alive. He's one of those men who looks at numbers the way a doctor looks at an X-ray. He sees things other people miss. I'd called him the week after Kevin's first visit and asked him to look into the landscaping business quietly. Just tell me what you see, I said. What he saw wasn't good. Kevin and Diane's business was carrying more debt than I'd known about. 2 years behind on the small business loan. State tax lien filed the previous spring. Miles said they'd been managing it technically, but that managing was being generous. One bad season would tip them over. I sat with that for a while. I didn't say anything to Kevin. I wanted to think. Then came the Thursday in October. Kevin had called me that afternoon to check in, normal enough. We talked about the Yankees for a while, about whether I needed anything from the hardware store. At the end, he said he and Diane were going to stop by Saturday with some paperwork. Just something having to do with the business restructuring, he said. Nothing for me to worry about, just a formality. I said fine. Saturday was fine. After we hung up, I sat in the kitchen for a minute. Something about the way he'd said, "nothing for me to worry about," stayed with me. That's an odd thing to say to someone who hadn't expressed any worry. I was going to get up and start dinner. Instead, I looked down at my phone and realized the call hadn't ended. The little timer was still running. 37 seconds. 40. Kevin must have set the phone down without disconnecting. I almost hung up myself. I almost just pressed the red button. I didn't. I heard Diane first. Not the words right away. Just the tone, the bright, flat tone of someone who's finished performing and let the performance drop. Then Kevin's voice. Then both of them, and what I heard was laughing. And then Diane said, clear as anything, "He didn't even hesitate. He trusts you completely. This is going to be so easy." And Kevin said, "By the time he figures out what he signed, it'll be recorded with the county. There's nothing he can do." The timer on my phone read 1 minute, 12 seconds when I finally pressed end. I didn't move. I just sat there in my kitchen with the phone on the table and the overhead light buzzing the way it always does, and I felt something I hadn't felt since Helen's doctor sat us down and used the word inoperable. That particular kind of stillness that isn't calm. That's the opposite of calm. I picked up the legal pad. I wrote down exactly what I had heard, word for word, with the time and date at the top. Then I called Miles. He answered on the second ring. I told him what had happened. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Arthur, don't touch anything. Don't sign anything. And don't let on that you know. Can you do that?" I told him I could. That was the hardest thing I've ever agreed to do in my life. Saturday came. Kevin and Diane arrived at 11. Diane had coffee cake again. I noticed that and said nothing. Kevin had a folder with him. He sat down at the table and opened it up and started explaining. I was only half listening because Miles had already told me what to expect. Something about restructuring the company assets into a family LLC, something about tax advantages, something about how this would protect me if I ever needed long-term care down the road. There were 4 documents in the folder. Kevin pointed to the signature lines with a pen. My pen, actually, the one I keep in the cup by the notepad, which bothered me more than it probably should have. I said, "Let me read through these." Kevin said, "Of course, take your time," in the voice of a man who did not expect me to actually read them. I read every word. I took 40 minutes. Diane got up and got herself more coffee, and I could feel the impatience radiating off her from across the room. Kevin kept checking his phone. The documents were not what he had described, not even close. One of them was a general power of attorney, broad, durable, effective immediately upon signing. Another transferred majority ownership of a holding company that would, according to the fine print, include my house as a contributed asset. There was language buried in the third document about my voluntary acknowledgement that I may have diminished capacity to manage my own finances. I set the papers down. I looked at my son. "I'm going to need a few days," I said. "My eyes aren't what they were. I want to have someone look these over." Kevin said that was completely fine, absolutely no rush. He was lying. I could see it in the way he glanced at Diane. They left around noon. I watched Kevin's truck back out of the driveway, and I stood at the window for a while after they were gone, the way I used to stand at job sites after the crew had left, just looking at what had been built or what still needed building. I called Miles back that afternoon. Then I called an attorney he recommended, a woman named Carol Brandt who specialized in elder law and estate planning out of an office in Hackensack. I'd never needed an elder law attorney in my life. I didn't love needing one now, but I made the appointment. Carol was direct. I liked that. She looked at the documents Kevin had brought, and she set them on her desk, and she looked at me over her glasses and said, "Mr. Sutton, if you had signed these, you would have handed someone else complete legal authority over your finances, your property, and your medical decisions, effective immediately." I said I understood. She said, "I want to make sure we talk about why you haven't confronted your son yet." I told her about Miles's advice. I told her I wanted to understand the full picture before I moved. She nodded slowly and said that was, in fact, the right instinct. but that we needed to move quickly because Kevin might escalate if he sensed I was stalling. She was right about that. He did. The following Tuesday, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. A man who said he was a geriatric care assessor, contracted through a county wellness program, just doing routine outreach to seniors living alone. Would I be available for a brief home visit Thursday afternoon? I wrote down his name. I thanked him. I told him Thursday would be fine. Then I called Carol. She wasn't surprised. She said this was a pattern she'd seen before. When a family member is trying to establish grounds for guardianship, they sometimes arrange for cognitive assessments that appear routine, but are actually being used to build a paper record. If the assessor concludes you show any signs of impairment, she said, that becomes evidence in a guardianship filing. She told me exactly how to handle the visit. Answer every question clearly and completely. Do not appear defensive or angry. And she said, this part I wrote down, you are allowed to have your own professional present. I will be there. She was. She sat in my living room Thursday afternoon, introduced herself as my attorney, and watched the entire assessment. The assessor, a young man named Jeff who seemed genuinely uncomfortable with Carol's presence, went through the standard questions. Date, year, current president, count backward from 100 by sevens. Draw a clock face. Remember 3 words after 5 minutes. I got everything right, every single item. I am 67 years old and I ran a company for 3 decades and my mind is as sharp as it ever was. And sitting there answering those questions, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. A kind of cold, clear fury that had nothing to do with fear. The assessor left. Carol stayed for another hour. She had been building the other side of the case while I'd been handling the assessment. She'd already filed a fraud complaint with the state attorney general's office based on the documents Kevin had brought. She'd also connected me with a forensic accountant who was looking into whether Kevin had misrepresented the landscaping business's finances to me in writing, texts, emails, which would be relevant. He had. There were texts. Kevin had told me the business was doing really well, just needs a little capital injection to scale. The state tax lien said otherwise. I want to stop here for a moment and say something about what it feels like to discover that your own child has been lying to you. Not a small lie, not a kindness lie, a constructed, deliberate, months-long effort to deceive you. There's a specific grief in that which I don't think I can fully put into words. It's not like losing someone to death. It's like finding out someone you thought existed, never quite did. You grieve a version of a person who, it turns out, was partly your own imagination. I grieved that version of Kevin. I did it quietly, in my kitchen, over 2 or 3 nights. I didn't call him, I didn't tip my hand, but I let myself feel it. Then I moved forward. I had already called Sophie the week before. I hadn't told her everything. I didn't want to put her in the middle before I knew what we were dealing with, but I'd asked her to come over for dinner one Sunday, and we talked for a long time. I told her about Helen's last few months, things I hadn't talked about with anyone. I told her about the company, what it had meant to build it, what I hoped it would mean when I was gone. She sat across from me at this table and listened the way her grandmother used to listen, completely, without fidgeting, without waiting for her turn to talk. At the end of the night, I told her I might need her help with something. I asked if that was okay. She said, "Grandpa, what do you think the answer to that is?" I'd already begun the process, with Carol's guidance, of restructuring my estate. The house was moved into a trust. The assets from the business sale I'd sold the company 8 years ago, good timing, good price, were reorganized in ways that made them significantly harder to access without my active participation and Carol's office in the loop. Sophie was named as successor trustee, not because she was the only grandchild, not out of sentiment, because when I looked at the people around me and asked myself who I would trust was something I'd spent my life building. Her name was the one that came without hesitation. Kevin called me in the 3rd week of October asking if I'd had a chance to look over the documents. I told him I had. I told him I had some questions and could he come by Saturday. He said of course. He and Diane arrived at the same time as Carol. I'd forgotten to mention Carol would be there. Imagine Kevin's face when he saw her sitting at my kitchen table. That moment told me everything about what he'd known he was doing all along. A man with a clear conscience doesn't go pale when he sees an attorney. Carol handled most of the conversation. She laid out, calmly and specifically, what the documents Kevin had brought actually said. She explained the fraud complaint that had been filed. She explained what the forensic accountant had found. She set a copy of the tax lien on the table. Kevin tried twice to interrupt. She let him finish and then continued. Diane said nothing. She sat with her coffee. No coffee cake this time, and said nothing at all. At the end, Carol told them they had two options. They could cooperate with the investigation fully, including repaying the money Kevin had taken from the business account that had been jointly held after Helen's death, $17,000 over 14 months, which the forensic accountant had documented. Or they could choose not to cooperate, and she could describe what the alternative would look like. Kevin chose to cooperate. He didn't look at me when he said it. I looked at him. I looked at my son for a long time, at the side of his face that was turned away from me. And I thought about the night he was born, the weight of him in my arms, the way Helen had cried and laughed at the same time. I thought about teaching him to ride a bike in this driveway. I thought about his first day of college and how I'd shaken his hand, because neither of us knew how to do anything other than shake hands at moments like that, and how I'd driven home wishing I'd hugged him instead. I still love my son. I think I always will. Love doesn't require you to be blind to someone. It doesn't require you to let them take what isn't theirs. Kevin and Diane left that afternoon. The legal process took several more months. There was a repayment agreement, supervised by Carol. The fraud complaint resulted in a formal investigation that ultimately didn't lead to criminal charges. The DA's office determined the documents hadn't been signed, and the intent, while clear, was harder to prosecute cleanly. I won't pretend that didn't sting a little. It did, but the assets were protected. The house was protected. The trust was structured. Everything I'd spent my life building was where it belonged. Sophie came over for dinner the night after Kevin and Diane's visit. I made pot roast, Helen's recipe, the one she'd gotten from her mother, who'd gotten it from hers. Sophie ate 2 plates and didn't say a word about it being too much food the way her dad always did. After dinner, we sat on the back porch. October in New Jersey, just starting to get cold. The leaves on the old maple in the yard were almost completely down. Helen had loved that tree. She said it was the reason she'd agreed to buy the house. Sophie said, "How are you doing?" Actually, I thought about it for a moment. I told her I was okay. I thought about it for a moment. I told her I was okay. I told her I was tired in a way that sleep didn't quite fix. I told her I was still figuring out who I was, in the chapter of my life where I was mostly just protecting what I'd built, rather than building new things. She said, "Maybe that's still building, just a different kind." I looked at her, 19 years old, her grandmother's eyes, her own kind of steady. "Your grandmother would have liked you," I said. "She did like you. I mean, she would have liked who you're becoming." Sophie nodded. She didn't fill the silence with anything. We sat there for a while in the dark, the two of us, while the maple stood bare and the neighbor's porch light came on down the street, and somewhere a few blocks over, someone's dog was barking at something it probably didn't need to worry about. I am 67 years old. I spent 31 years building something from nothing. I lost my wife to a disease that gave us no warning and no time. I almost lost what I'd spent my life on to someone I had trusted because he was my blood and my child, and I believed, in the way fathers believe things, that love was enough to make a person honest. It isn't always. That's the part no one tells you when you're young and optimistic and you think the people who are yours will remain the people you believe them to be. But I also found out that Sophie was exactly who I thought she was. Miles was exactly who I thought he was. Carol was competent and thorough, and she fought for me the way a person fights when they mean it. And I found out that I was still, at 67, capable of sitting in my kitchen with a phone on the table and the worst thing I'd heard in years playing back in my head. And instead of reacting, instead of calling my son and saying everything I needed to say, choosing to wait, choosing to be strategic, choosing to protect what I'd built, instead of just expressing how badly I'd been hurt. Helen would have said that was the engineer in me. Plan the job. Work the plan. I keep the yellow legal pad on the counter still. I write things down. Dates, times, phone numbers, whatever needs remembering. It's an old habit, like I said. Some habits are worth keeping. I've thought a lot about the moment I almost pressed that red button. 1 second earlier, one reflex, and I never hear what Kevin and Diane said. I hang up, I make dinner, I show up Saturday, and I sign 4 documents that would have handed them everything I spent 31 years building. Not because I was foolish, because I trusted, because he was my son, and I believed that meant something durable. That's the part people don't talk about when they talk about situations like mine. They talk about greed, about manipulation, about legal documents and fraud complaints. All of that is real, and all of that matters. But underneath it is something quieter and harder. The fact that the people most capable of hurting you are the ones you let closest. That's not a flaw in your character. That's just the math of love. You can't protect yourself from everyone and still have anyone. What I learned, and I mean learned the slow, expensive, painful way, is that trust and verification are not opposites. I trusted Miles for 22 years because he had earned it, consistently in small ways and large ones. I trusted Carol within 2 hours of meeting her because she looked at those documents and told me the truth I didn't want to hear without softening it to spare my feelings. That kind of trust is built on evidence. It's a different thing entirely from the trust I extended to Kevin, which was built mostly on the fact that I wanted it to be deserved. There is a version of the story where I react the moment I hear them, where I call Kevin back, furious, and say everything I'm feeling. I understand that impulse. I felt it. But rage, however justified, would have handed them the advantage. An angry old man making accusations without documentation is easy to dismiss. An attorney sitting at your kitchen table with a fraud complaint and a forensic accountant's report is something else. Patience is not passivity. That's what I want anyone to take from this. Sitting in my kitchen for 3 weeks, holding what I knew, not tipping my hand, that was the hardest work I did through this entire ordeal. It required more discipline than building the company did, because building something, you have momentum on your side. You see progress, you have good days, waiting and watching and saying nothing when you want to say everything. That's a different kind of strength. Quieter. Nobody sees it happening. Sophie saw it, I think. She's 19 and she understood something that my son at 43 apparently still hasn't figured out. That what you do when no one is watching and what you do when everything is on the line and you're scared is what actually defines you. Not your intentions, your choices. Kevin made his choices. I don't know what comes next for him and Diane. That chapter belongs to them. What belongs to me is the house and the trust and the maple tree in the backyard that Helen picked, and Sunday dinners with Sophie, and the yellow legal pad on the counter where I still write things down because some habits are worth keeping. I am 67 years old. I am not done, not even close.